AI has just needs so much more processing power. We just recently heard the solution from China has certainly reduced power consumption. So maybe there's some light at the end of the tunnel there. Maybe in the future, even like small scale nuclear power plants, even though I think this is still quite a bit out in the future. So we have all these resources. And on the other end, we have the big consumers, and the trick is to really aggregate this all. So those are a number of these aspects, moving away from old restrictions on energy trading to more open market, but with this fairness in mind. And that is, of course, a tricky part, a tricky situation. And that's where also then standards play a role, because you want to make this all scalable. You want to make it so that in the future you can really, at a reasonably low cost, add to the system and standards, the space that I'm in primarily. I think it's really important now that the IT managers, CIOs and so on, really actively try to gain an understanding about what's going on in the grid.
Welcome to the EM360 Tech podcast, where we have a weekly conversation with people who are impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Shubhangi Dua, an editor and tech journalist at EM360 Tech. Data centers are becoming power-hungry giants, and the question is, how do we feed them? Today, I'm joined by Rolf Bienert, the technical and managing director of the OpenADR Alliance. In this episode, we dive into the future of data center energy, assessing innovative solutions like microgrids and virtual power plants, and considering the broader implications of sustainable data center technologies. Hi, Rolf. How are you?
Hi there. Good morning. It's great to be on.
It's nice to have you on. Before I get started with the questions, would you be able to tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you became a part of OpenADR?
Absolutely. As your listeners can probably hear, I'm originally from Germany, but I lived for 21 years in California and only recently moved back to Europe for a variety of reasons. And originally, I actually come from telecom. So I always like to say that any cable that's more than a millimeter thick is really too much for me to handle. But somehow, about almost 20 years ago, I got more involved in the utility space when we developed the first protocol standard to control energy-related devices. This was in the Zigbee Alliance and was called the Smart Energy Profile 1, which was developed in the early 2000s. And really the idea was to start networking between things like thermostats and other systems in the building that simply can consume energy or later on, of course, also produce energy. So that's where I started with this again in the 2003, 4, 5 time frame. And since then, of course, we came a long way. So I joined multiple standardization efforts for global standards and ended up then in 2011 with the OpenADR Alliance, which brought me on board to manage all the technical aspects of the standard. And since 2018, I actually do the full management of this industry group, which is a nonprofit organization.
Wow, that's amazing. It sounds like you're making a lot of impact out there. So
we try what we can, right? It's not easy to move things on a large scale.
Yeah, but I think trying is what matters, which is what is needed in the sustainability sphere, I suppose, today. We hear a lot about data centers needing to become more sustainable, but often people in the tech industry say it's all just branding. Can you give us a little historical perspective on the drive for sustainability in the data center industry?
Absolutely, yes. And, I want to probably kick it off by saying there is certainly a little bit of a hype and branding there as well. But it's certainly true that when data centers really popped up more and more, and we should realize this was already also in the early 2000s when, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and so on, when these services started, all of a sudden we saw the need for much more data processing. And in fact, it's also important to have more localized data processing. And by localized, of course, I mean more like countries and regions, not necessarily towns and cities. So we saw these data centers pop up, and large consumers of energy are nothing new. There have always been manufacturing plants and railroad and other consumers that take a lot of power. But every time we find ourselves faced with a new consumer of energy, whether this is like a data center or nowadays heat pumps, EV charging, and so on, right? We all of a sudden scratch our heads and wonder, okay, how are we going to supply these systems that are completely new to the market? Because efficiency has over the decades, helped quite a bit with curbing the increase in general energy consumptions. But yeah, when you have a fully new consumer there's only so much you can initially do with efficiency. And of course, we also saw a lot of, changes coming from the regulatory side. Climate change is a big factor, right? General energy sustainability. And I think the big problem for the data centers is that they just fell into this category, right? A new consumer that needs a lot of power consistently. And at the same time, we actually want to reduce the more consistent power sources like fossil fuels and possibly also nuclear power and things like that, right? So that's really what drove a lot of these problems, if you want to call it that way. And of course, now everybody talks about AI. It's almost already too much talk there, right? But AI just needs so much more processing power. I just recently read an article again, factor 10 to 100 times the processing power as a Google search. If you have a simple AI search. And so, yeah, there will be more and more of those problems there. Although, of course, we just recently heard the solution from China has certainly reduced power consumption. So maybe there's some light at the end of the tunnel there.
Yeah, China is constantly on top of tech like that. Like in fact, trend you see, they're on top of it for some reason. But I don't want this to just be a trend. But that reminds me, I remember, I think, was it Google that in fact is developing data centers now using nuclear energy. But initially they started their own data centers to hone in the powers of AI. AI was consuming so much computational power that they had to build like more data centers just to support it. Or maybe there's a direct relation to it. But I remember reading this very clearly somewhere, and I wrote an article about this and mentioned Google in there. So I guess what I want to ask you from this is it truly a realistic goal to focus on, let's say, net zero 2050, that goal, and making data centers as energy efficient as possible and as focused on sustainability as possible? How can organizations prioritize the regulations today, and how can they practice their technology more sustainably to be able to meet that goal?
And there's certainly a number of different factors that come into play here. And a big one is cost, of course. It's initially the cheapest way to get the energy is to just buy it from the utility, literally. But if you look at the more long-term goals and cost factors, there, of course, the renewable energies do make sense for these systems. Now, the big problem, of course, is that many renewable energies are not as consistent as a regular power plant, which you can dial into a certain number and up and down regulate to a certain extent. But we all know, right? The sun is shining more or less, and obviously goes down at night. Wind goes up and down, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a number of factors here that needs to be balanced out. And I think that's really where the key lays, is that you have to have a number of these resources to balance them in the end. So you can have wind, you can have solar. An example just came to mind. I visited the Ajax football stadium in Amsterdam. They, for instance, do it that way. You know, they have a huge solar array on the roof. They have their own wind turbine, and they have a large battery system in their basement. So, of course, not quite comparable to a data center because their events happen typically in a confined time frame in the evening, but they managed to tie all of these systems together to run these football events fully net zero. So with their batteries, remaining wind, solar, and so on. So really at the end, it's having all these resources combined, but that creates another problem about location, right? Because you just cannot put necessarily a few wind generators everywhere. And the same is true probably for solar, but that's probably a little less visible there. But yeah, this combination, I think, will be the key to make this sustainable. And then to your original question, I think it can be feasible. Maybe there will always be a small baseline of power that may need to be at least available, that they can just continue the operations, whatever happens, right?
I feel like as a consumer myself, we don't really realize that data centers are the foundation of so much in society, so much, not just tech, but like they do form the basis for so much. So it really comes at a critical time that we talk about it now that there's more investment going into data centers than ever before.
For better or for worse, right? Everybody is on their phones and on on the computer here, right? And things like that, right? And I don't think it will change anytime soon, really.
No, I think more and more will just go into it, in fact, to making it more feasible and sustainable. So data centers are using more and more power, and we hear a lot about the need for smart grids. Can you explain what a smart grid actually is and why it's so important when we're talking about powering these energy hungry facilities? Where does it come into the play?
Yeah, and so maybe it might be good to kind of also look a little at the history of the power grid for your listeners. If you think about energy supply, probably even only 20 years ago, but maybe let's go a little further. Maybe let's go 50 years ago. There was a utility company or energy producer, and they simply, as we said before, had a number of power plants, which were typically scaled so that they can supply the power needs for all the people and all the businesses and so on in the area. And the utility would simply sell that power to the customer, and you would rarely get to this limit. If you saw these kind of scenarios where we would approach with the consumption, we would approach the production limit, then they could re-regulate the power plants. So fairly straightforward. But even there was already some automation in place, of course, for transformer systems and so on. But nowadays, the electrical power becomes so important, as we already just said, right, in all aspects of our lives, that it becomes more and more critical that all the systems of the grid talk to each other. And so often when we talk here in these kind of scenarios about smart grid, people think about devices in the home and do this and that. But really, you have to also consider that all the grid equipment on the background, from transformer systems, or as we call them, substations and so on, they need to exchange information. And that's why it became so important that we have a lot of communication systems between all of these different components of the grid. And that's really where the smart grid started. And that was not even known to the consumer, right? So where the consumer first got confronted with it was likely the smart meter, where all of a sudden you don't have like an analog meter anymore, where you can see the little dials ticking away as you're using energy. now you have a digital meter, and there were, of course, concerns about connectivity and privacy and all these things. But at the end of the day, these become really critical for the grid to understand how much power is consumed in different areas. And this is not really down to an individual household in most cases, but rather the utility needs to understand where are the pockets of power usage, and now also with renewable energies being available locally in residential settings, where do I get potentially power back and so on, right? So we're seeing now this grid control system broadening down to the smart meter. And lastly, now we're starting to talk about really sending messages to customer owned equipment, whether this is EV chargers, batteries, solar systems, all the way to then the data centers, microgrids, VPPs, and so on, to basically motivate them, help the grid balance everything. Because as we said already, the renewables are not as reliable anymore, and you have all of the sudden a large number of different producers out there as well. So not only those power plants that we originally had, but we have all these producers, whether this is residential solar or the wind turbines, things like that out there. And all of this needs to talk to each other. So when we talk about smart grid, really that's the gradual increase, right, of system integration between all of these different types of equipment.
So it sounds to me like orchestration between these different renewable energy sources is very important to make a data center run effectively. So when we talk about that, though, from an enterprise perspective, how should businesses in this industry tap into that power? How should they optimize their systems and kind of get better at, I suppose, making it more sustainable and smarter for today's age?
I think one critical factor, we could talk about a lot of things, of course, but I think one critical factor is, I think we are seeing this happening already, is that you really have to just have the mindset and have to start to understand the requirements from the grid, right? It used to be that an IT person at small company to a large company, right? They had no interest or no reason to look at, okay, what is my power supply, right? So they might have had some small backups, right? So that their servers don't stop in the case of a power outage, but that was about it, right? That the rest they didn't really think about. We saw it in telecom, where I come from, right? In telecom, this was a bigger deal because there were mandates that regular phone lines stay available in the event of a disaster or a power outage. So the phone companies, for a long time, decades, I would almost say not quite 100 years, but quite a long time already, have typically huge battery banks in their systems. So a lot of people don't realize that. But regular landlines, which almost nobody uses anymore, they keep working. They keep working in power outages. And now we're seeing this more and more also in cellular networks. But back to your question, though, in an IT environment, this was never really a big problem past the power outage management. So I think it's really important now that the IT managers, CIOs, and so on, really actively try to gain an understanding about what's going on in the grid, and of course they have to do this for data center now even ahead of time, right? I mean, this is now a huge consideration. If you build a new data center, you cannot just only buy the land to build a data center, right? So you have to see, how do I get the power there? How do I make space for the renewable portions, batteries, and so on and so forth. So I think really that is the shift we need to see more and more. And I think in a lot of cases, this is already there, but that will start the conversation. And on the other end of the scale, right, we need the utility folks to be also equally well informed on these options. So I think we're seeing this knowledge building, but there's probably still a lot of discussions we have to have. And lastly, I think it's really also important to have a really concise message for the general public, right? Because they might only see headlines of, increased power consumption for this and that, and they might not be able to get more power for their EV, so there needs to be a real harmonizing message that we all need to create. And I'm guessing that, your podcast is helping with that in the end.
Yeah, I hope so. So coming back to the certain other renewable sources of energy and I suppose resources for data centers, if we can talk about microgrids and virtual power plants that seem to be gaining a lot of traction as solutions for powering these data centers more sustainably, in fact. Could you explain the key differences between those two approaches and what makes them so compelling for this application and to enterprises?
Absolutely, yes. And to be honest, I like to be fairly pragmatic. And in OpenADR, we also, with the standard, we like to kind of keep it reasonably simple in the communication between the utility and the customer-owned equipment. So for us, a VPP, a virtual power plant, and a microgrid are almost interchangeable, if you will. If we want to distinguish here a little bit, it's probably in the size of the system, really. So I'm sure there will be some people in the comments correcting me on that, but be my guests, right? If it is what it is. But essentially, both of them aggregate small, medium, or large energy resources together. We already spoke about that earlier, right? You have solar, you have batteries, you have maybe other generators, other renewables, hydro, and so on. Maybe you mentioned it already, maybe in the future, even like small scale nuclear power plants, even though I think this is still quite a bit out in the future. So we have all these resources. And on the other end, we have the big consumers. And the trick is to really aggregate this all together to have essentially a net zero outcome. And you present that to the grid. So again, a microgrid, you could argue it's possibly a bit larger. So it could be like a hospital campus, university campus, big firms, Apple, Google, and so on. Or, of course, big data centers with other areas that are aggregated together and managed. And if you want to distinguish them, the virtual power plant would probably be a little bit smaller in my mind, that it is maybe a building, the building itself, maybe even a residential building in this case, where I have a battery here at home, I have my EV plugged in, I have some solar, I have a heat pump and all these things, right, that should work together to also, again, present a fairly neutral power consumption picture to the outside. And there are a number of efforts, for instance, going on from where I used to live in California. There are some energy resellers that, in fact, really try to create a concept for a VPP, which they also like to install, for instance, in lower income households, which is a very big topic because, yes, if you have some money, at least you can fairly easily buy solar and take advantage of all of these things, right? But if you don't have that much money available, so we need to think about these things as well. So for the data center, it is really a matter of aggregating all of this together. And that's what the microgrid and the virtual power plant approach really mean here. And we are seeing companies that are coming out with good solutions there.
So in terms of enterprises, I suppose, both small and large, do you have any advice for how they should accommodate, how they should sort of sign up with these data centers according to what resources that these data centers have? Like in terms of these different like VPPs and microgrids and smart grids. And I'm sure there are many other solutions out there. And like you said, like nuclear power plants in the future. How should enterprises really be signing up with data centers to power their computations? And how should they sort of look at it? And what should they really be out there looking for, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, we already talked about a lot of the aspects, but maybe one interesting additional topic to consider here is that it could become even a revenue stream for them as well.
Hmm.
If we talk about an enterprise that it sets up the different data centers, right? Maybe renewables, maybe microgrids and so on. In the first place, of course, they are only considering their needs for data processing and such. But we have seen this in a lot of markets that sustainability, renewables, integration, the aggregation of all these systems, in fact, also provides a business opportunity. If you install a good amount of these systems, where in particular also storage, you can potentially go back to the utility companies, right? And you can make deals with them to potentially export power when they need it, because we focused a bit on data centers, but this balancing is really needed in the entire grid these days, because we have a lot of, electrification efforts going on. We want more EVs. We put everything electric. We get rid of the fossil fuels. I mentioned earlier the switch to heat pumps, from like gas systems and so on and so forth. So we need this balancing in all the areas. And if you have this capacity available, all of a sudden it becomes a nice bargaining chip for the enterprise to say, hey, I have this power available, and maybe at certain times, I cannot really comment on the load curves for these data centers, but at certain times they might have availability to export this, and they can maybe do that for a certain amount of money. And at the same time, they might have the opportunity to actually buy cheap energy from the utility to even charge their batteries and things like that, as there's more energy available from solar and renewables that are somewhere else in the grid. So this might be, aside from all the technical things that we already discussed, this might be something that not a lot of people think about in the first place, right? That they could become, in a sense, an energy provider as well.
True. And if we had to talk about the regulations, what are some of the most strategies that will be feasible today, keeping such regulations in mind when an enterprise wants to leverage renewable energy into their data centers?
Very good question. And I have to say, I'm neither a lawyer nor a regulator here, right? But of course, the trick is that long-term regulations may need to be significantly rewritten, because they come from a time, as we said earlier, 30, 40, 50 years ago, where it was simply about delivering power for money, period. So there was no other processes and so on in place. So, but now, of course, we have this whole interaction, right, where money can flow in different ways, which has never been envisioned, right, 30 years ago. So all of a sudden, we have to look at fairness with the regulations, because like one interesting example that recently is a relative term here in the last few years popped up in states like California, for instance, where there is an interest to have dynamic prices. So the prices can vary during the day, right? So from a regulatory perspective, it seemed like it's not too difficult, but how are we going to tell the customer, for instance, what the price is at any moment? So it would be rather unfair if the utility can increase and, of course, also decrease their prices depending on the market situation, but the customer has no way of actually knowing that. And when I say the customer, I mean more like automation equipment at the customer, because really the customer at the end of the day is not really interested in knowing what their price is every half hour, right? So you just want your system, whatever you have, whether it's an EV or solar, to act accordingly. So those are a number of these aspects, moving away from old restrictions on energy trading to more open market, but with this fairness in mind. And that is, of course, a tricky part, a tricky situation. And that's where also then standards play a role, because you want to make this all scalable. You want to make it so that in the future you can really, at a reasonably low cost, add to the system. And standards, the space that I'm in primarily, that's what we are envisioning, that it is simple to add on.
Looking beyond just the technology, what roles do you see for standards and best practices in ensuring the sustainable growth of the data center industry? And what are some of these key areas where further development is needed?
Yeah, I think, what we see a lot and what I hear a lot also from the members of the OpenADR Alliance, for instance, is there are a number of good standards out there that have by now pretty much become the reference from OpenADR to like IEEE standards and so on. So there's a number of standards there for different aspects of this management. But I think what's still lacking is the system approach here, right? We talked about a VPP, right? So a VPP, a virtual power plant, has all these different components in it. They all use certain standards, rightly so. The plug that goes in the car, the connection to your house, the plugs of the solar panels. I mean, people might not realize, right? But these are all standards that are there. But I think what's still missing is to really set up system approaches that scope the different standards that are involved and create a consumer digestible idea, marketing message, and so on behind it, so that we really, as a consumer, I mean, you and me are probably deeper into this than others, but as the regular consumer, you want to have it easy, right? You want to buy an electric vehicle that conforms to standards, so that you can charge it everywhere and things like that, right? And there are now a number of efforts going on. We do some of it in the OpenADR Alliance. There's a Mercury consortium popping up in Europe that actually wants to do exactly that, to specify these system approaches. And at the end of the day, circling back to the data centers, that will help here as well. Because if there are common practices, the utility understands what the data center can provide and needs. And then at the same time, the system integrators can use the same functionalities on each of the components, then it will drive down costs significantly. And it will not be an individual implementation project each and every time, but will get cheaper over time. And that's really where the standards played a big role.
I think that's a great answer, and it's a great way to wrap this up, in fact. But before I let you go, if you could summarize one takeaway from our conversation today for CIOs, what would it be and why?
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about a lot of the aspects already, right? So it's almost a little bit tricky to bring out another one. But I would say really one of the critical aspects is the overall communication between all parties here, right? So often, I think myself and everybody included, we are in our own space and we are not necessarily looking past that. We already talked about it, right? Hey, potential business opportunities with exports. So these are some of the ideas. But again, I think we need to really have very early on open conversations between, say, the CIO and the utility company and the builders and the general public, because often, and we see that in politics a lot these days, it doesn't matter which side you're on, you see headlines, and the headline driven news cycle is just really not a good thing for any of us. So having this open conversation early on, I think, will eliminate a lot of concerns and fears and make this all much more sustainable and smoother in the future.
Thank you so much, Rolf, for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on. Also, thank you to everyone listening. We hope you took away a lot from today's podcast. For further information on what we've talked about, then please head on over to openadr.org. We'll be back next time with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms. Follow the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on X and LinkedIn. And for great daily content, head on over to em360tech.com. Thank you.